introduce our speaker for the evening. I've been a huge fan of Rachel's for a while now, for about a year, I guess, since her book came out. So I'm very excited to have the opportunity to bring her to Gen Space. Just a bit about Rachel before we start. She's an artist based in Brooklyn. She is a Guggenheim, NYPA, and McDowell Colony Fellow. She has spoken on the TED Main Stage and the Long Now Foundation. Her book, The Oldest Living Things in the World, is a New York Times bestseller and was published in 2014. She has been profiled and featured in the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, the BBC, NPR's Picture Radio, Science Friday, and many others. She was also awarded the LACMA Lab Art Tech Grant to pursue her new work with SpaceX, NASA, and CERN. So I will introduce Rachel.
Before we start, here is a donation ball that we would be very appreciative to keep events like this going. So it will be, should we just put it over here or pass it around? Pass it around. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I feel like it's going to be like I'm speaking to my people here, sure you all have some art and science background and interest. So I'm going to be pretty casual. I'm going to go through I'm going to start by going through a number of the questions that I often get asked first about this work. But I'd love to turn this into a discussion as well, because I'm sure you all have interesting perspectives, both in this work and your own. So one of the first things I'm often asked is how I got the idea for this project. That's a different seminar. It costs $5,000, and it's about creativity. So I tend to think of my process as engaging in creative churn. That's something that you're familiar with, is sort of following different threads of ideas and not necessarily being sure how they're going to connect with one another. And for me, it was both a literal and figurative journey that got me going on this project. So back in 2004, I had just done a residency at the Cooper Union, and I just got a new camera. I still shoot film, medium format, a 6.7 and Mamiya 7.2 for any camera geeks there out here. And so I got this new camera, and I got this invitation to visit some friends in Japan. And I've always loved to travel, and it might be a cliche, but I think it can truly change your perspective and open your eyes to different things when you're traveling, especially in a culture that's really foreign from your own. So I went to Japan. I was in Tokyo having a nice time, interesting time, and then realized that I really wanted to engage in some kind of journey. Like I was looking for something, but I didn't know what it was. So then I was traveling on my own for a while. And I don't speak the language. I was by myself. It was a little bit, it was a little stressful, and I had some moments of feeling like, I'm not actually having a great time. Like, what am I doing here? I'm in Kyoto by myself. You pull into the train station, there's Kinko's and Starbucks, like not beautiful temples, and it just sort of, something wasn't sitting right with me. But I'd had a few conversations with different people in different places who said, if you're interested in nature, which I was and am, they said you have to go visit this 7,000-year-old tree on this island called Yakushima. And it was interesting to me that a few people that had no connection to each other were telling me, you should visit this tree. So I had this moment, and it was, I was taking in, that possibility, but considering going home as well, like sort of giving myself permission, like, if this isn't right for me, maybe I'm just gonna go home. And, and then I thought of this, one of the few phrases that some Japanese friends had taught me before I went over there, and that was fundoshi o shimete, which literally means tighten your loincloth. And it means buck up. It's something your grandfather would say, buck up. So I had this moment where I decided I gave myself permission to go home, but instead I went in the opposite direction. So I went to the southernmost part of Kyushu. It was a long train ride, and then from there is a several-hour ferry ride from Kyushu from Kagoshima to Yakushima. And then when you get to the island, it's a 2-day hike to visit this tree. So it was truly this pilgrimage to go there. And on the way over, I was befriended by this couple who, took one look at me and were like, "What are you doing here?" tourists don't go here. They knew I wasn't part of the English language program because they knew those people, and I told them, and they're eyeing my rolling suitcase and wondering how I'm going to make this hike to the tree. And by the time we'd landed on the island, I was invited to stay at the home of the family they were going to visit. And I just had this magical, rewarding travel experience. And I ended up hiking with them. And it turns out that one of them had done the English translation for the sign for this tree. So it couldn't have, if that wasn't a sign, I can't imagine what would be. So I didn't have an epiphany standing in front of the tree, though. I made some photographs in the book. I had been thinking about doing an art and science project. I'd been thinking about combining philosophy in my photographs. I was doing a lot of work making landscape work about the relationship between humanity and nature, and trying to incorporate my own philosophical thinking. Whether that translated or not, it was a little bit more nebulous. But I took that experience with me, took it back home, and it was over a year later, back home in New York. I was in Soho having Thai food with some friends, telling them a story just like I shared with you, and then the light bulb went on. I was like, oh, this is it. This is the way that I can combine all of these different threads that I had no idea how they were going to connect, but then all of a sudden they did. It was clear as day that I would find the oldest living things in the world. And those things would be organisms that are continuously living, that have been alive for 2,000 years or longer. So that goes into this idea of deep time and putting human time scales into perspective. So why is it 2015 right now? Like it's really 4,500,000,000 2015, and that I could use real science. That I had this idea. I'd never worked with scientists before, but it became this way where I could engage with scientific research, do this travel, make photographs, and incorporate this philosophical thinking that to me lent not just depth, but really the context for the entire project. So I ran home that night and just started Googling. So, thank you, Google, because, if this was pre-internet days, I'd probably just be scratching the surface. This was 10 years, by the way, so from that trip to this, a decade. So
half a pound per year.
Yeah, exactly. It's about half a pound a year. So because how many people in the audience are scientists? Good. So for me as an artist, it was fascinating to start working with scientists. When I got the idea for the project, I thought I'm going to find a scientist who's going to partner with me through this whole project. We'll do this project together. I'll be on the art side and they will be on the science side. And I quickly learned that that was not going to happen. So I met with a couple of different evolutionary biologists, and I quickly learned that they basically recused themselves. They said, I'm not qualified to do this. And I said, well, what are you talking about? And they all said, this is too broad. So science tends to be ever specializing. So if I'm including plants, certainly, that's the bulk of my subjects, but there's also bacteria, fungi, coral, that's an animal. So I basically very quickly learned if I wanted to do this project, I was going to have to be the expert in it. So instead of working with one scientist, I worked with 30. And I used my way in, I think, and then eventually what I found was people who love what they do are happy to love sharing it. And so 9 times out of 10, I would track down a published scientific research paper, find out who the author was, send them an email. 9 times out of 10, they were so thrilled to hear from me, in part just because a lot of this research is very esoteric, and in part because they're excited to connect with somebody, especially outside of their field. So in some ways that's saying, like, wait a second, this thing that I'm doing over here that doesn't get much attention is actually connected to the world at large and through art and culture. So for me that was wonderful as well, because that meant I got to share my thinking about how these things all relate to one another. And I did my homework. I read the papers. I certainly didn't take for granted that this was very specialized work. Often what would happen is I get invited to join them whenever their next field work was scheduled. So oftentimes I would just fly somewhere and meet up with the research team. Other times I'd be handed a map or some GPS coordinates and told good luck, which usually worked out. I did have a few misadventures along the way. So a couple of things I wrote about in the book. The two that spring to mind are getting lost alone in Greenland. Don't recommend it. I won't tell you the whole story now, but for me, the lesson that I learned is even if you're going to meet people who have a satellite phone, if that phone is not in your hand, it is useless to you. But anyway, obviously I survived. And then, I had another mishap that was in Sri Lanka. I was going to visit the Maha Bodhi tree, and the night before I was going to visit it, I slipped and fell and broke my wrist in a remote part of Sri Lanka. And was, went to the hospital, the open air of dogs and chickens and me, and obviously made it out of there as well. But so it wasn't all fun and games, but it certainly was part of the process. This project was basically a lifestyle. But so what I would do was basically go in sort of these cycles. So I would do the research, make the contacts, plan this sometimes very elaborate travel. Getting to Greenland, for instance, is not that easy, or getting to 6 different sites all over Australia. These are things that end up taking quite a lot of time. And I should mention I'm not independently wealthy, so there is a lot of attempts to fundraise or just get really creative about how to make the money flow. And sometimes that was just putting things on my credit card. So I really put everything I had into this work. And I would say I would do it again. I mean, I'm glad I don't have to do it again at this moment because it is a little exhausting too. But it was certainly a rewarding process. And it's just really interesting, and I won't go too much into this now, but I'm starting to do some new work about deep time and deep space, and I continue to want to work with scientists. And I found that through the act of contacting so many people over the course of doing the oldest living things, I now have, I don't know if it's just a matter of building confidence or just understanding that, I can do the same thing, walking into JPL and talking to an astrophysicist. Like, people want to engage. And if you bring this openness to the table, I found that you tend to get it back. I'll speak a little bit more about the art side. So actually, forget I said art side because I don't want to side them. This is transdisciplinary work. It's all following the idea. So the concept of the oldest living things was the center. Everything that I did for the project always had to relate back to that concept first. In some ways that differentiates us from a purely documentary photography project or just a scientific project. It's really a conceptual project about deep time and our human connection and perspective on that, along with these other layers of things like environmental issues and creating personal connection. So it's always sort of ping-ponging around between facts and experience and personal connection. So my background is in the fine arts and specifically in photography. For me, photography is the perfect medium for this project, though, not just because of the obvious of going to make images of these actual organisms, but because of the temporal layering that happens. So, and what I mean by that is, you take a photograph, it's a split second. So it's like the 60th of a second click of the shutter to make a photograph of these organisms that have been here 2,000, 10,000, 500,000 years. And then there's me somewhere in between that span, and everybody in this room is, experiencing those photographs, and all of a sudden, these different planes of time operating in the same, coexisting in the same moment. And to me, that's really poignant. So there's different ways that we can relate to these organisms, and I've definitely tried to encourage this anthropomorphizing that can happen. Like, what would it be like to be alive for 2,000 years? And on. So it's a little hard to tell when you're looking on, well, actually, my exhibition prints are probably around the size of the projections here. So I do have an exhibition that's traveling right now, and it's a combination of these images, as well as some infographics. So I'll just hold one up now. So in the book, I have, like, this is a 2-page deep timeline that starts before the Big Bang and goes 5 billion years into the future. So, go big or go home. And then I have some other infographics that I made as well with the help of a designer. And they include a Linnaean taxonomy and a map of all of the locations of all the organisms, as well as a growth strategy analysis, which is a very loose way that I was trying to analyze basically this data set of these organisms. Like, what are the commonalities of them? And I'll get back to that in a minute. So the exhibition includes the photographic prints, which are the most formal aspect of the exhibition. And then I have the Linnaean taxonomy printed very large on the wall with 4 images with handwriting underneath. And you'll notice in the book and on my prints themselves, I handwrite the titles. And that's a nod to scientific field notes. And the titles all contain a lot of information. It's the name of the organism, the age, as well as the location. And I should mention, if the locations are secret for any of these, which some of them are, then I only very broadly say what the location is. So, for instance, there's a eucalyptus in Australia that's, it's so endangered, there's, I believe, 5 or 6 of that species left on the planet. So in order to get permission to make photographs of it, I can tell you what state it's in, but not even tell you its common name. Because if you knew that, you could then deduce where it lives. So, I'm not trying to drive throngs of people to actually visit these sites. It's more to show that they belong to all of us, and we're part of this continuum and are connected to one another, which is very different from saying, hey, let's just turn these into another tourist attraction. And we'll get back to that as well in a minute. But just the last element of my exhibition, I created a room that's full of my research materials. It's a research studio installation filled with the scientific papers that I've used, but also just quirky things that I've collected along the way. So, things like my x-ray of my wrist in Sri Lanka, and the little box of my typhoid vaccines. That just struck me as funny. And just some of the things that I picked up along the way, in part because I wanted to humanize this project, in some sense to show the messy underbelly of it, that just the tremendous amount of work, the more personal aspects of it, and to just provide another way into the work. So, because there's so many layers to it, my feeling is whatever way people get in is great. So if you're a scientist and you're excited that you see some research that you relate to, excellent. If you're an artist, photographer, and appreciate the prints, great. But if any other layer in between there, if that captures your imagination, that to me means that the project is successful. So one of the things I was going to return to, the tourist attraction, we've lost a couple. I have 30 subjects that are in the book. We've lost 2 of them in the 10-year period that I've been doing this work. One of them was this tree in just north of Orlando, and it was the original tourist attraction there, BD, before Disney. It was this 3,500-year-old tree, and it was hollow in the center. So this often happens with old trees that get just hollow out over time. And some kids snuck into this park at night. It had a fence along the road, but not along the back side of the park because it's this marshy swampland. And these kids snuck into the park at night, hopped over this really sharp-looking iron fence so that they could do meth inside of this hollow tree. And then posted about it on Facebook when they said they were lighting their lighters to see their drugs better, and ended up setting this tree on fire from the inside out. So it was on fire for a week before anybody knew about it, which at that point, it was too late to save it. Another organism that we lost was one of the underground forests in South Africa. There are more of those. They're really unusual. Well, unusual for other parts of the world. There's a number of them there. They're unique in that they adapted to the ecosystem there, which has quite a lot of fire. So as a way to protect themselves, several different species of shrubs basically migrated underground, so that when the fire runs through, it just takes a little off the top and then you regrow leaves. But there's this tremendous structure of essentially the whole of what would be a trunk and roots underground. The one that I photographed was around 13,000 years old outside of the Pretoria Botanic Garden, and it just got paved over to make way for a new traffic pattern. These are not good things, and obviously were done rather callously. For me, the story of the senator tree in Florida was a really important moment in understanding, I would say, again, in terms of this idea of the context. I first visited that tree in 2008. And, I made some photographs. It was really easy to go, I'd just been to Africa. I'd just been to these exotic, really difficult places. And when you go to Orlando, it feels a little bit, anticlimactic. And I got there and, I made some photographs and I wasn't really happy with them. I didn't feel like I really captured the essence of this tree. And I thought, you know what, I can come back. It's easy, it's so easy. Of all the places I made to go, this one is a piece of cake. 5 years later, it was dead. So this tree that had been alive for 3,500 years was now gone. So once I had heard that this had happened, I immediately went down there, and there's a photograph in the book of the tree after it had fallen. But it was really, for me, an awakening in terms of fully understanding the difference between longevity and immortality. They are not one and the same, and you can't take them for granted. And one of the things, people ask about my own perspective on time and has that changed, and I say that yes, it has. I spent a lot of time thinking about deep time, but I think at that moment I connected much more viscerally and immediately with this sense of, oh, wait a second, every moment matters. It's all connected. What we do matters in the larger scheme of things, even though as humans we're really only here for a blink. So I think I'll just leave the formal talking part there and would love to open it up to questions.
So you talked about losing 2 of the 30 items in 10 years. How many have been gained?
Oh, yeah. So
how many discoveries?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Well, so even when the book went to press, I have, I think, 5 or 6 that are in there that I list at the back, the things that I know about that I wasn't able to get to. Sure. So some of the, for me, some of those reasons included, I don't have a submarine, so if somebody has access to one, there's some coral. So, and I should mention, I was so fascinated to learn about corals being this old. And the corals are animals. This wasn't something I'd really thought through before. So I photographed this 2,000-year-old brain coral. But that's the youngest of the old corals. So there's one in the Scandinavian Arctic. There's one off the Hawaiian archipelago. And then there's this supposedly 15,000-year-old barrel sponge off the McMurdo station in Antarctica. So that requires an under ice remote operating vehicle. Because I learned to dive for this project, but I'm not doing under ice. I have to drive the lines. But in general, things were discovered during the 10 years that I was working on this, a number of things were discovered. So the oldest known living thing, the Siberian actinobacteria, was discovered during the course of my project. So that was discovered by a team of planetary biologists who went to Siberia specifically because the conditions are so harsh. So I'm sure you're all familiar about the amounts of research that get done in the harshest parts of Earth. They weren't looking for something specific. They just knew this was a good place to look. So they took a core sample of the permafrost and found that this bacteria was doing DNA repair below freezing. And so it's unique to this bacteria, and it's between 400,000 and 600,000 years old. And that I found out about because there was an artist I know's New Year's Eve party who happened to invite the scientist who was on the team. Like, this was 2 years before the research was published. So there's all these amazing, just sort of social connections that ended up happening. So, and then other times people have emailed me like, hey, did you know about this thing? And, yeah, but I am quite certain we're just scraping the surface, especially in areas beyond trees that I think we have covered, the clonal organisms in particular. Yes, phase 2. Yes.
How do they date these organisms?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So how are the organisms dated? It's different. This actually goes back to my initial question to the evolutionary biologist saying, why won't you partner with me? And the answer in some sense is tied up with how do you date these things, because they're different. If you're looking at the age of a tree, which is a unitary organism, and doing dendrochronology, counting tree rings, the way you would date that is very different from dating, for instance, this 43,600-year-old clonal shrub in Tasmania. In that case, there's a multi-pronged process that we go through. So one step involves finding some fossilized material around the site, doing genetic testing to match the fossil to the living organism, and then doing radiocarbon dating that fossil. So that's why we can come up with a number like 43,600 and say that's a minimum age, because you can't guarantee that's the oldest, even if it's the oldest fossil, that's proof that is the date that this organism came into being. And so different things have, there's often combinations of things like growth rate analysis and this kind of genetic backup. So you'll see my ages often end in round numbers or lots of zeros, and that's because these are estimates, but they're well-researched estimates. But it's often a combination of multiple factors that suit whatever the organism is.
You mentioned earlier, I wanted to ask kind of a little about your artistic process of, did you capture the essence of this thing, or kind of wanting to anthropomorphize certain things. How do you know when you have captured a world? How do you approach yourself?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's something that I think over time developed for me, over the course of doing the project a little more. Up until this time, the work that I was doing, making these very lush landscapes, and some were more formal. It was very much about the aesthetics. That wasn't the case with this project, and I think early on it was hard for me to kind of settle into it in terms of feeling like, well, I'm not just taking a snapshot, but I have no desire to make these sort of aggrandized National Geographic kind of photos, like sit and wait for some perfect beam of light. That wasn't what I was doing either. So for me, it varied based on the organism. Sometimes I had this immediate sense of how I wanted to make an image. Sometimes I didn't. And in narrowing the images down in the book, I made a conscious choice to make sure that I felt good about each photograph. Not that if it didn't do its work as an image, then it got left out, even if it was telling some part of the story. That being said, there are a number of images in the book that are not the actual organism. So I included some of these landscapes and some details that for me were really important, both to set the tone about what these different things what their landscapes were like, in some places just what my experience was like. So I don't have a direct, straightforward, easy answer for that. But it just became clearer over time, it was, so part of it's, I guess, just intuitive.
You use the phrase deep time, and I was wondering if that's your phrase, is that a scientific phrase?
So deep time is not a scientific term the way geologic time measures, cosmic time even, but it's not my term. It's the term that's out there that's really, for me, it made perfect sense to use it in the context of this kind of work, because it's meant to put you into perspective, or allow you into a time scale that's outside of our human experience of time. In some ways you think just in the biological, neurological sense, like our brains aren't really built to process these deep time scales. We understand what 100 years feels like, maybe, generationally, we have a handle on that. Once you start talking about thousands, 10,000s, 100,000 years, we don't have any physical connection to it. And in some ways that makes sense in an evolutionary standpoint. Like, what would the benefit of that would have been if the life expectancy was 28 years old? There's just no reason. But now we have the luxury of being able to do that. So for me, it's meant to evoke I think it's a bit of a poetic term as well. So I think that's really important when you start. Now started looking at some astrophysics, but where the astrophysics and philosophical thinking start to slip, like that's a really interesting place to be.
When you say deep space, what do you mean by that?
Oh yeah, well, so that's one of the questions I get asked now is what am I doing next? So I'll spend a few minutes to tell you that. And actually I'll mention a couple specific, I'll back up just a step to a couple of my oldest living subjects. One was this lichen that I photographed in Greenland that's around 3,000 years old. I learned about astrobiology through this because I found out that it was sent to outer space and exposed to outer space conditions and returned completely healthy and intact. And I hadn't really given much thought to astrobiology before, but that's the study that's dealing with the idea of life existing certainly outside of Earth, and potentially that life could have originated outside of Earth and piggybacked in on a meteorite, that sort of thing. So that was a fascinating thing. The other one is the stromatolites. Are you all familiar with stromatolites? No, okay, got it. Yeah. Always say it. So stromatolites are part biologic and part geologic. They're made of cyanobacteria, which is living and performs photosynthesis, and non-living material. Oh, stromatolites, good timing. Non-living sediments like sand and silt. You can see, it's going to change in a moment, but you can see the yellowish color was the living stromatolites. Anywhere where there was some black, that's dead. So they look like rocks, but they are alive. Stromatolites first appeared around 3.5 billion years ago, so that's some pretty deep time for you. And they did the job of oxygenating the planet, and it took 900 million years. So once I learned that, I visited the stromatolites toward the end of my project, and once I started doing that research, it just became clearer to me that I wanted to venture deeper into time and out into space. Literally, probably not, but it's more possible than ever. But I get pretty motion sick, so I don't feel like I'd be a very good astronaut. So now, in the past year, I've been spending some time at different space agencies. I spent some time at SpaceX and at NASA JPL and Ames and at CERN, in part very much back in that process of creative churn. So I was describing, sort of being out in the world and searching for something and not quite sure what it was. So in some ways I feel like I'm back in that space. But I also have generated a few different ideas, so I'll just give you, for instance, one of the ideas that I have, this is is not yet green-lit by any means, but I was visiting CERN, I was having these fantastic conversations with particle physicists and cosmologists, and got to see some of the experiments. And I had this one day where I didn't have any meetings booked, and you can't just, wander in from the proton accelerator, But I wanted to engage with what was going on there, fundamental physics, and I was just thinking about art and science, and scientists trying to describe the nature of the universe just the way artists often do. But I had this idea of wouldn't it be nice to walk above ground the collider loop, which is 17 miles around, and that's okay. And it's not marked. There's a bit of a road, a bike path on the road. But I had this idea of why not turn that into a walk representing all of time. So it would start at the Atlas experiment, which is specifically looking at the few seconds after the Big Bang. And the idea being you could go one direction, it's 13.8 billion years ago, you could go the other direction, it's now. You go the Big Bang route, you're walking for almost 10 billion years before Earth even exists. So I'm trying to create this way that you can, it's again, that sort of trying to make some connection to these things that our brains, get excited about but have trouble holding on to. That's another stuff.
Do you think the outcome of this would have been different if you would have done it collaboratively versus solo?
That's an interesting question. I'm sure that it would have. In some ways, I'm really grateful that it challenged me in so many ways because I had to be the lead scientist, which was, it certainly expanded my sense of, what it means to continue to learn things, what it means to engage with people who are outside your own discipline. And yeah, I'm sure it would have been different. It was really interesting to me talking to different scientists about the same subject. So it really opened my eyes. I was like, wait a second, there are a lot of nuances and disagreements and things that it's like, oh, well, this person represented this thing in one way and somebody else represented it in another. They're both right, maybe. But then to fall on me to mediate that into this artistic project was great. So that was definitely, I actually had the same experience just the other day. I'm making some neon signs, so I'm making neon singularity, neon relativity, which are meant sort of like this tongue-in-cheek way to look at things that, these equations that are meant to represent this, this elegant description of the universe. And then also, if you make something in neon, it's automatically art. So I was looking up the equation for relativity, and I found 3 different equations, and I couldn't figure. I'm not a physicist, and I had this moment like, well, wait, do I need to be more of a physicist to make this art piece? I don't think so. So I contacted a physicist who described oh yeah, they're all right, and this term is unnecessary, or some people like this, and this is why. And I'm so glad to have that conversation with him. So he knew and was able to describe it in this way. I then made a decision based on that. And that's something that I want to both share and incorporate in the work as well. So I'm sure it would be different, and I'm glad that it is.
Can you describe a little bit about what it's like to plan to arrive at a spot with this organism and what it feels like to approach that organism for the first time?
I'd have to give you 30 different answers to that question in some way, which is interesting because in some instances, I would have this immediate response, such as feeling some connection or some awe. Other times, it really was anticlimactic. Some of these organisms are quite small, they're unremarkable. I'll give, for instance, of the lichen in Greenland. I was searching around with a biologist who was working with some archaeologists using lichenometry to study lichen growth on Norse ruins, and we were exploring the area looking for the oldest lichen, which was completely based on size. So we're like, oh yeah, that one was measuring, that one's a little bigger. So there was never a moment of, oh, we found it, here it is, because also nobody really knows in some sense. Which is very different from, walking into the giant sequoia forest. So, as however dated anyone might be, you can't help but be just humbled and awed before these massive organisms. So in some ways it's very personal, like it was based on, what was my experience getting to this place. So I can't leave here without telling you my experience going to Antarctica. So I went to Elephant Island to find this 5,500-year-old moss. Anybody here Shackleton fan? One. So do you know the Shackleton story at all? So he was part of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. This was 100 years ago, right after the South Pole had just been visited. People were trying to do things like be the first to do something, like cross the continent with dogs or circumnavigate. There were all of these, like, I want to be first, explorations that were quite difficult. But then you got go down in history. Shackleton's ship, though, went down before they made land. And the thing that's remarkable about this was that he and his crew, all men, of course, were able to get off the ship. They got stuck in ice, so the ice floe just basically surrounded them, and they couldn't move. They survived for 2 years in Antarctica with just what they had with them and their wits. And about a year of that, I believe, they spent on Elephant Island, right around the corner from this 5,500-year-old moss that I was going to look for. So I was reading the story, Endurance, which I highly recommend, while I finished it while I was there. Every time I had this moment of feeling like, well, it's pretty cold or this is really hard, I thought about, Shackleton and his crew basically wearing wet sweaters and, eating seals for 2 years. And it really sort of snaps things back into perspective. The other thing about that story is they came to their own rescue. I just get a chill when I think about it. So they're on this island. They realize they're not where anybody would think to look for them because of the way the ice floe moved. They hit land. They're in this weird spot. They know nobody's coming for them. And they have basically, a rowboat. That's all that's left, a little emergency dinghy from their ship. And they have one shot of rescuing themselves, and that is to get to South Georgia Island, which is 600 or 700 nautical miles off. It's slightly, within the Antarctic convergence, but it's a little bit warmer, and it's just sort of, if you follow the Antarctic Peninsula, it's just out to sea. They had maybe some navigational tool, but just basically, if they missed, they're done. If they did, it's this little island. If they don't get there, that's it. But they made it. They made it to this island. They land on the wrong part. They hike over this glacier, and then they walk into a whaling station. And that, by the way, was right around the corner from my backup moss, a slightly younger moss. And so the connections between that just were, I just love that, and I just felt like Shackleton would really appreciate the perseverance of this moss. What was the question? So my experience when the moss itself, I had a friend who'd done one of the artist and writer programs going to Antarctica. She, in a guidebook, had seen something saying how the moss on Antarctica was really old. I said, okay, not any specifics. And then I started tracking down research. I found this 25-year-old research paper, and it turns out nobody had gone back to look for this moss in any of the time since then. So for me, to be able to figure out where it was, the first time I saw it was standing on the bridge of the ship with the captain's binoculars. I'm still a little speechless. For me, that moment was really pretty profound. Yeah.
Some of this sites religious sites as well.
Were they what?
Religious sites as well.
Oh, so there was the only one that was a religious site was the one where I broke my wrist. So that's actually a great story. The Sri Maha Bodhi tree is tied to the historical Buddha, and the story is that the tree under which the Buddha was enlightened, he had a dream before he died that he wanted a branch sent to Sri Lanka and planted there. And it was. And so this tree is one of the oldest known, it is the oldest known cultivated tree in the world, and it is at a monastery. The original tree in India ended up getting burnt down in some protest at some point, and so the tree, a branch from the tree in Sri Lanka was then sent back to India. So there's something very poetic about that, but also really interesting in terms of figuring out how old it is, because they know the date that the tree was planted in Sri Lanka, but they don't know how old the original tree was. And then if you start looking at, well, you could argue it's a clone, so it's that age plus the age of the original tree. So I thought that sort of was a nice segue into these, into the discussion of different methods of timekeeping. So certainly a lot of that was religious, but certainly we all adapted to that now. But that was the only one. That was, strangely, my first cousin is married to a former Buddhist monk from Sri Lanka who had put me in touch with the monastery there, and they were going to show me the tree, but I have still not seen it. Any other questions?
The bacteria. What is the oldest bacteria?
That's the Siberian actinobacteria.
That was one from the exobiologists were looking at.
Yes, exactly. And so I didn't go to Siberia for that one. They were doing the research at Niels Bohr Institute in Copenhagen.
Because there was a question on whether or not, it turns out we kill bacteria all the time, but it's such a unique life form. It's not clear that on its own, under the right conditions, it wouldn't just keep going.
So
doesn't really have a life cycle like humans or animals or eukaryotic organisms have. So
I'm betting after, depending on whether we humans can interact together, the bacteria are going to there's some things I'm more worried about than others. That's not one of them. So yeah.
Do you find yourself compelled to talk about, the importance of biodiversity or connection with climate change, like telling the stories of humans are aware of these other organisms?
Yeah, I think it's really important. So I'll tell you briefly the story of this tree that's on the cover of the book. This is a 9,550-year-old spruce tree. I'm sure that's not your first guess. We're from Vermont. This, I feel, is a portrait of climate change. The reason being, this mass of branches at the bottom here is what it looked like for 9,500 years. Around 50 years ago, the stem sprouted up in the center because the climate zone changed. The vegetation zone changed at the top of this plateau where it lives in Sweden. It got warmer. And so for me, this is a really perfect example of, this is this remote place. Most people won't be able to find this specific tree, so we're not there doing things like chopping it down or doing drugs with it or something, but we're impacting it. And for me, these organisms all serve as symbols of this larger interconnectedness. So, you think, often with conservation issues, there's some star that helps you protect the polar bear. And a great example, and there's this amazing story about the EPA? Or because the bear was endangered, then the EPA was able to instate some new emission standards. So anyway, obviously, we are all part of the system. My hope is that by connecting with these organisms, that people will be more compelled to protect the whole environment in which they live. So, it's something certainly that I think is really important, and also something that can be, it's often hard to talk about environmental issues without pointing a finger and, you know, people coming away feeling chastised. And so my hope with this is that it's more like get to know these things, and hopefully through that there'll be more of a sense to act responsibly as a whole.
I'm a reporter, I'm so sorry.
No, you're fine.
You have one image of this very strange plant that looks like it just hasn't been watered. It's really all over its
The Welwitschia.
What is the story behind that plant?
Yeah, so the Welwitschia lives in Namibia, in the desert. Namibia is basically all desert. There's not too much, not too much green stuff there. And it's actually a tree, so it's a primitive cone-bearing tree. And it has all sorts of amazing, unique properties, including what looks like those massive branches, or a pile of massive leaves on both sides, are actually two single leaves, and they never lose them. And they just pile on top of each other and then get shredded up into those different sections. So there's this wavy trunk in the center, and then you've got the crazy wavy leaves on either side, and then they bear cones. And they have a very long taproot, but they only live in parts of coastal Namibia and Angola because mostly they're getting their moisture from the sea. So the coastal fog that comes in. They're the national plant of Namibia. And if you're an Namibian child and you're misbehaving, the Welwitschia might come and get you. So be careful.
What about the organism it looks like mini green moss that comes up?
Yeah. That's the Ureta. The Ureta is basically the poster child of the project. It is actually not moss. It is a shrub, and it lives in the Atacama Desert. I should not offer to flip to a page. I can't find it. It's in there somewhere. So it's in Chile. So northern Chile in the Atacama. So it's about 15,000 feet elevation. And maybe you've recently seen those photos of the Atacama in bloom. They've sort of made the rounds, that sort of thing. Parts of the Atacama have no recorded rainfall, or didn't until a few weeks ago. Went bananas. But the Ureta grows for, and actually thank you, it brought me back to one point that I meant to make earlier, which is one of the things that these organisms have in common is they tend to live in these extreme environments. So this isn't true across the board, but a lot of them have some degree of hardship. So high elevation, low nutrient availability, low moisture, extreme temperatures. So that was a really interesting thing that just started to emerge. What's that?
Is there a reason?
I don't know. I mean, that's the question. So in part, that's the question in terms of the science of this. There is no area of the sciences that deals with longevity across species, but there should be. So
actually, it almost goes, or it strikes me as being related to the bacterial question, the longevity of that, because while bacteria can grow very, very, very rapidly, it often can be environments where there are not a lot of resources available to it, and then it goes shut down. Wait. Good times, good now. Wait. And so longevity could be viewed as waiting for a really, really, really long time. And those extreme environments would selectively encourage those types of behaviors, potentially.
Yeah.
I don't know, it just strikes me as being
Yeah. Well, so for the purposes of my project, I wanted to only include things that are continuously living, which is not a scientific term per se, but so your description of bacteria shutting down for a while, that would not fit my project. If something is going dormant for a while, it does not, for extent, that's not part of an annual cycle, that sort of thing. I did not include. The Siberian actinobacteria is doing DNA repair below freezing, so it's not dormant. It's active. So that was why I chose to include that, and not other things that we found. We went to Antarctica and found something that has been hidden away for however many hundreds of thousands of years. Not that that's not a perfectly valid thing to be exploring, but for me, it didn't fit with this idea of making that connection to the individual and, I mean, of course it gets fuzzy, but continuously living as a way to, again, back to the anthropomorphizing.
Actually, it raises another philosophical question. What does it mean to be alive? Because if you're waiting,
I'd
are you
say,
alive? Yeah,
are you DNA based?
Yeah.
Yeah, then you're alive.
The bacteria are waiting, but they do go into this kind of dormancy. We have, on this one floor above us, negative 80 C freezers, where the bacteria can be there for very long, as long as we have power, for a very long time.
Well, that as long as we have power, that sort of goes into, these clonal organisms are theoretically immortal because they can keep cloning themselves, but there's the caveat of as long as favorable conditions persist.
And also a deep space trajectory, going back to one of your other comments, almost the space seed type of model from Francis Crick. Yeah, it's pretty cold. It's going to be cold for a long time in space. And so there's almost this kind of preservation that goes on while you are traveling to that medium, which is, you're waiting in a way to get to whatever your destination is that will allow you to begin to flourish. That's pretty neat.
So if one pattern that you noticed was these harsh conditions promote longevity, did you notice any other patterns?
I mean, the other primary, very predominant quality was slow growth rate. So there are a few exceptions, the baobab trees and a couple other things, but a lot of them the vast majority of them are very slow growing. And so I have an infographic at the back of the book, which is this growth strategy analysis. It's very rough because we're working on so many different timescales and criteria. But basically, it shows that the oldest things are growing the slowest. So it's not flashy. It's slow and steady.
Is it possible that the reason why we find this because the reason why they've survived as long as they have is because those areas are stable to humans?
That's a really interesting question. That's another thing that, in some ways, I just find kind of hilarious because now that I've spent some time with some of the researchers, I mean, some of the stuff is just all around us. It's just what was easiest to get to. So even in Antarctica, the mosses that were studied, that one was around the corner from their base camp, or we saw that when we happened to be flying over. There's so much randomness and also just ease of accessibility, even in these incredibly remote places. To me, that says there are all sorts of things. I mean, set alongside the ocean floor. So much of what's been researched has been based on ease of access. So the flip side, of course, is how much are you going to find in downtown Brooklyn? But on the other hand, I did a little bit of research out on a marsh in Staten Island last year, which may contain some up to 10,000-year-old marsh grass. Possible, not confirmed. But there's this untouched bit of marsh on Staten Island that has so I talked with somebody who has the glacial record, who's been looking at the soil samples out there, and then the potential of this type of grass that lives there is known to self-propagate. And somebody has to care enough to do the genetic testing and some additional research, but it's possible. So in some ways, it depends on where the money is, where the interests lie. I have a handful of subjects in Africa. I'm sure there are more, but a lot of those places, a lot of the locations aren't safe, or it's not a priority in places where you don't have enough clean food and clean water. So, there's far more human convenience built into the scientific process than I would have thought before I started the project.
How is it that a lot of these things have been preserved or not?
It varies. My hope would be that all of these things would now be afforded. Ideally, they would all have UNESCO protection. A couple of them do. Some are on private property. One of them, I won't tell you which one. The owner of the property doesn't even know that he has this old organism. common property. So the scientists have kept it under wraps, with the fear that if it gets out, then it might end up causing the destruction of it. And I at one point had looked into, is there some way to campaign for all of them for UNESCO? And there isn't. It has to be individually, and that was just a little bit too much for me to take on. But it varies tremendously. One example of something that does have protection is the Seagrass Meadow in Spain and the Balearic Islands. So it's this 100,000-year-old seagrass meadow, palmal seagrass meadow, that's had that protection for years, but not because of the age of the seagrass, but just for the ecosystem in general. It's my hope that we can get more and more protections for these things. But even the tree that was burnt down, it was double fenced, and still, people get to it. So, the other thing is that some of these, the bristlecone pine, I'm sure you're all familiar with. You can go take a hike around the ancient bristlecone pine forest, but they've taken away all the signs that say this is the Methuselah tree, which, by the way, isn't even the oldest bristlecone. So they sort of, by rolling back some of the information, and this is something I've actually struggled with a bit, in terms of, there's a tree that's older than Methuselah, which I do talk about in the book. There's no way to identify any specific, there's no way to find it. So in some ways, I want people to know, because these things are fascinating and they belong to all of us, and yet we as a species have been pretty irresponsible. So it's trying to strike that balance between sharing what's so awe-inspiring about these organisms, but also making sure that they're protected.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Her book is for sale up here. I highly recommend it. And please help yourself to wine and food, and we'll all mingle for a bit. Sounds good. Thank you again.